So let's just have a little overview of what we're going to be journeying with structure, like where we've been, where we are now, where we're going with structure. So in KFP1, we introduced you to muscle testing and muscles, and how muscles relate to organs and glands, and how when your organs and glands aren't good, your muscles might not be good. And then we introduced you to the idea of using reflexes to balance muscles, and we understood that those muscles had an impact on the structure of the body. And then we learned the 40 muscle balance, where we're doing a whole balance balancing 40 muscles. So we're combining an understanding of the meridian wheel and the chi cycle with how the muscles relate. And then I forgot what we did in KP2, but I'm sure it was significant. In the KP2, we also looked at like the how you could kind of work directly with muscles, like with origin insertion technique, which we revised from KFP1, and then how you can actually balance muscles with spindling, and how you can balance muscles with a Golgi tendon, so looking at neurological control of muscles and how they can be balanced with those manual techniques. And yeah, that's all I can remember. Then we went into Chinese medicine. And then in KFP3, we started to look more at structure, because we looked at like the neuromuscular control with gaits and cross crawl, and we looked at how the nervous system regulates our movement. And we mentioned that if your nervous system is confused, then how your movement's regulated is confused, and how your structure can be impacted from that. And so gaits can fix a lot of structural problems. And then we looked also at the cranial stress release. So you're working on the sutures, so introducing cranial bone interactions. It's affecting a lot of things, like they're structural, but we kind of suggested that they impact widely on the body, even at a spiritual level. And then in KFP4, probably the main thing we looked at with muscles was reactive muscles. And then over the course of that KFP4 and the reactive muscles, we're looking at how some muscles have too much tension, some muscles don't have enough tension, and how that deregulates the structure of the body and impacts on the body. And probably pretty much after that, we've left it alone since then. Haven't really structured much. So one of the things I like to just remind you about is that in applied kinesiology they have like the treatment triangle. They kind of have psychology. What's psychology? Psychology. Okay, so here we started. And then you have like structure, biochemistry, so structure, physiology, biochemistry, and they kind of all relate together. That was sort of like the initial sort of concept that was sort of adopted by kinesiologists emerging from chiropractic. And then when we were the first law of biochemistry also, structure governs function. So at a biochemical level, the body sort of built from proteins, like everything sort of, all the chemical reactions are controlled by proteins, and so we're all kind of held together by protein structures. And those protein structures are coded for in our DNA, so they're all like form part of our genes, and then they're kind of read from the DNA, and then kind of manufactured in assembly lines within our body, and then they form these proteins. And biochemists, like observing these proteins, came up with the conclusion that it's the structure of the proteins that govern their function. So the structure governs function. So if you kind of change some of the amino acids in the sequencing, the structure changes radically, or might be minor or radical, and depending on where it is, it can have a big impact on function. And within the chemistry of the body, so the chemistry of the body is run by these things called enzymes. And so they're a class of protein as well, these enzymes, that facilitate all the chemical reactions. So without these enzymes, and without them being in the right shape, so the right sequence from the genes in the right shape, then those enzymes won't work properly, and your body won't work properly. And there's a whole big interest at the moment in what they call enzyme polymorphism. You ever heard of that? So enzyme polymorphism is the shape or different sequences from the DNA having variation in different enzymes. So you might have a different enzyme to you and vice versa. Slightly different protein sequences and the shape changes slightly. And then the efficiency of the enzyme changes. So it might be too fast or too slow in its chemical support of the body. And and it creates big variations in how our bodies work. Some people, get infections easily. Some people, build up toxins easily. Some people, have lethargy, more than other people. And a lot of it is just these variations, in the enzymes that work in the body. And that all comes back to their structure. So their structure is slightly different and their function is slightly different. And then when we're looking at like energy and vibration and energy, there's a concept of like harmonics, like things sort of propagate through things based on their harmonic. So like if you have a guitar and you strum the top string of the guitar, the bottom string will start to vibrate, and vice versa, because they're different. They're the same note, so they have the same harmonic. They sound different because one's higher and one's lower, but they're the same harmonic. So when one resonates, it sets the other one off. And if you look at different interesting sort of formations of the body, it has certain repeating patterns in it. So there's a concept called the golden mean. Or phi. It's the Greek letter phi, just like pi. If you like, have you heard of pi? So phi is another one of those special numbers like pi, and the phi ratio is found all throughout nature and all throughout the human body. So if I measure my hand and put it against the length of my forearm, I'll get the phi ratio in my body. And that's all through my body. There's really interesting ratio. If I look at leaves, I look at seashells, there's this recurring ratio that happens throughout the body. So there's like a natural occurring proportion. And it's likely that proportion allows like a spiritual harmonic to move through the body. And when aspects of our structure get distorted, then that harmonic won't necessarily pass through us properly. So we won't be, communicating with the other dimensions, like we talked about in the home and chakra awakenings, and also in the holographic muscle monitoring. So those harmonics might not carry through and break the communication. And that's why, sometimes when you're doing, some sort of emotional or energetic correction, it'll ask for a structural correction. And so that structure will need to sort of come back into alignment so the harmonics of the body are in balance, so the spiritual dimension can move through, so we can connect to spirit, and vice versa. So, you can't, the structure has a big part to play in the chemistry and the conduction of subtle energy through the body. So it's not like we're just lumps of meat and bone that can connect spiritually, arbitrarily, how that those lumps of meat and bone are put together. So yeah, so that ratio is really interesting. So that just sort of gives you a little bit of, a reflection on how we see structure. And often people will kind of try and isolate structure from other things. Like there's a tendency in natural therapies for people to go, structure is like, it's not as important as other things, but it's part of the whole integrated facets of the being. And so you can't really isolate it from emotional stuff or spiritual stuff or energetic stuff or biochemical stuff. It all kind of interweaves mystically in the body, which could be good news for some people and bad news for some people. I don't know if you saw the video that Kristen did that I posted. So, like a physiotherapist. Did you see that one? So, and she's saying, how she's been a physio for 10 years, and she's got a master's degree in physio and another degree in human health science or whatever, and then worked with Circus du Soleil for like traveling with them for like 3 years or something like that, and was an athlete herself. And then she's just saying, she's kind of remodeled herself from a physio into a kinesiologist, works as a kinesiologist rather than a physio. Obviously, what she's learned informs the kinesiology because she's got a good understanding of the body, but she gets much more success working as a kinesiologist with the body than she does as a physio. So, because you can't address a lot of the things that, a lot of the hidden determinants when you're working with structure from a structural perspective. And there's, interestingly, so many people out there who are very spiritual, very energetic, quite alternative, but whenever they have a structural problem, they're always looking for a structural solution. So they kind of go into their spirit and emotion and energy. But when I have a structural problem, I'll treat it as a structural problem rather than look at it emotionally and energetically, while they might look at it in other ways. So there's this natural tendency in our world to kind of disassociate the physical from the spiritual and energetic. And I guess it's just the way we've been educated and formed by society. But it's really fairly, sort of fairly primitive way of looking at it. So in the what was it, in the KFP1 and the RTK, I talk about how kinesiology works, and like if you look at like the brain, spinal cord, and then you look at the structure, So it's some vertebrae as just as an example. And you've got like muscles. So let's say a muscle here and a muscle here. And you've got nerves going into that muscle. You've got like the Golgi tendon and the spindle cells going from back into the brain, spinal cord. So there's a neurological communication between the muscles, all the joints, and the bones. And like these days, cars, they have all these sensors in them. Something goes wrong. Oh, there's something wrong with it, and they diagnose cars just by plugging them into a computer, and they tell you exactly what's wrong with them. It's a little bit the same. So we've got all these like sensors going through, and when this gets cluttered, so if this isn't organized properly, because the spiritual dimension, which organizes the physical dimension, gets disconnected, then the brain starts to overevaluate and overcompensate, get more emotionally disorientated and disorientated in terms of purpose. It starts to build up a lot of clutter. So it builds up lots of clutter. And so as it becomes more cluttered, the efficiency drops. So efficiency drops as the clutter increases. And it doesn't just affect one thing. It starts to, create distortions in how data moves through the brain and how the accuracy of different things happen. So there can be a breakdown in how the brain starts to interpret this information coming from the, they call it the sensory nerves, sending information into the brain. And then the tone system, which then controls the tone of the muscles, which is what happens when we have a hypertonic muscle. Receptors start to think that this is the right position, or the brain's interpreting it as the right position. So the bone's out here somewhere, it's being pulled out by the muscles, and the brain's going, yes, that's good. But I am having problems in other places and I don't know why. So it might be able to measure a problem in, the hip, and that's indirectly caused by its inability to fix that because it's thrown out the body. It's going, yeah, I can see there's a problem in the hip, but I can't see the problem here because of the drop in efficiency, and I don't know how to fix it, the problem that I see in my hip. So a lot of people go to a chiropractor and get it pushed back, but often what happens when people see a chiropractor is that it pops back out after a week. And that's because the brain goes, you put it in the wrong spot, because the brain's still cluttered, it's still inefficient, and it still sees it the same way. So it just pops it back to where it's supposed to be, or where it thinks it's supposed to be, not where it's supposed to be. So there's a distortion between what the brain, how the brain sees the body, and how the body looks, and how you're experiencing your body, problems it's creating. And so if you just start moving the structure around, in most cases, it'll just move back to the way it was, because the brain controls it, and the brain hasn't understood what the problem is, and the problem in the brain hasn't been fixed. So ultimately, we want to declutter the brain by resolving stress. So if I can activate this confusion in the body, find ways of strategically activating it, and then testing that in relation to the brain, then it can show up the different pieces of clutter in the brain that need to be resolved, and then we can start to resolve them. And then the brain will go, cripes, what's that bone doing over there? And start to pull it back by itself. So rather than getting forced back, it'll just start to reassemble itself back into alignment, because it's starting to see itself as it actually is. So we're kind of moving from the age of horse and cart into information technology. So it's unbelievably strange how we can be so advanced in information technology and still kind of not see the parallel in our own bodies, which are information technology controlled through the brain and the central nervous system. Any thoughts or feedback on that? So we as kinesiologists are extraordinarily well positioned to like work with this strategy and sort of take it forward in the world, while almost everybody, almost every other normal form of therapy is inept at doing anything at this level. So we have STF1, STF2, STF3, and then we have like a structural paradigm, and then sort of in between STF3 and structural paradigm, we have a course called Harmonics. And we also have a course called College of Kinesiology. So the SDF 1, 2, and 3 are more similar, but more advanced to like applied kinesiology strategies. They have like similarities to applied kinesiology, which is like the grassroots kinesiology that the chiros used to use. But then we learn to organize it in more sophisticated ways than what they do as well. And then the cranial kinesiology looks at the subtle cranial mechanisms in the body, which have a lot to do with the structural harmonics we were talking about before, with the golden mean ratio, what have you, and moving subtle energy through the body. So we're having kind of vibrational communication patterns aligning within the body. And the bioharmonics looks at that as well. So they both have elements of that, which then inform the structural paradigm, which is looking more at the axial structure of the spine and pelvis. That's looking at the cranium. And this is generally more looking at the peripheral of the body. And also this one we're going to look at how the nervous system works to organize alignment and movement. And then this one's going to be about musculoskeletal alignment. I can't spell that either. Musculoskeletal alignment. And then this one's going to be like how we can create like menu systems and also all the idiosyncrasies of all the different structures and joints around the body and how to activate and balance them. So this is more detailed support of specifics of joints, etc. And these kind of overlap with all the energetic courses as well. So it creates like a really nice bridge between sort of the structural, the energetic, and spiritual. So yeah, so there you go. So it's quite a lot of structural stuff. And with structure, you can sort of learn it, and you can this has a lot of reactives in it as well. You can sort of learn it, and understand it quite simply and easily. But mastering it takes quite a lot of time and effort.